This is my project on Dori Seda. I hope you like it. Dori Seda was an alternative comic artist whose work in the 1980s comic scene garnered a very loyal cult following that persists to this day. She is noted to have been inspired by the writing of Philip K. Dick and underground comics artists like Robert Crumb. Sita's provocative and honest, often very, very raunchy portrayals of the sex, drugs, rock and roll of bohemian life in Reagan's America continue to inspire the world of autobiographical comics to this day. Sita's friends and colleagues describe her as a true eccentric and a true bohemian. They all note her habit of sleeping through the day and working through the night, as well as her penchant for using drugs and alcohol and smoking lots and lots and lots of cigarettes. Sita often said herself that art was the only thing she was good at and dedicated her life to creating pure art. One of Dori's good friends, Bob Davis, said of her in the collection of Dori's work, Dori's Stories, he said, "More than anything else, Dori was an artist, and to her, the single most distinguishing fact about artists is that they produce. In the world of art, Dori was not a dilettante. She was a lifer, a hopeless addict. She couldn't stop creating new works any more than she could sing the title role in Bizet's Carmen." And Neil Gaiman, who never actually met Dori Seda, but was very inspired by her work, wrote an introduction to the collection of her work, Dori Stories, that says, "I remember the delight with which, as a young journalist, I first encountered Dori Seda's Lonely Nights, the drawing style which perfectly matched the stories which revealed too much, more than anyone needed to know, less than one wanted to know, about the creator herself. Wry, funny, smart stories, utterly profane, in which her irreverently honest attitude to the material rendered the profane sacred, or at least powerless. Dori anticipated and was ahead of the trend for confessional, personal comics. They became fashionable in the early 90s. But Dori Seda's work was funnier, smarter, and a great deal more fun than the horde of Harvey Pekar wannabes who were to follow. To start with her life, or what she gave use of it, was interesting." Though Dori's definitely most known for her comics, she worked with a lot of other mediums as well, including drag. This picture above is of Dori and her longtime friend Bob Davis dressed up as their drag characters. Dori's character, Sylvia Silicosis, was a comment on the black lung disease that would ultimately lead to her early death in the 80s. In Dori Stories, Davis reminisces about his time dressing up in drag with Dori and gallivanting around San Francisco's Castro district. He said, "Dressing up with Dori was like dressing up with any other drag queen. She would always hog the mirror." Sita's parents always encouraged her to pursue her passion for art. A lot of people think this is because her father gave up his passion for painting at a young age and instead chose to become an electric engineer, relegating his painting to a weekend hobby. After she graduated from high school, Sita gained a Bachelor of Arts in Art from Illinois State University, where she was primarily focused on painting and ceramics. Her ceramic art was as inventively obscene and full of social commentary as her legendary comics would eventually be. For one class, Sita created a 3 feet long ceramic vibrator with several intriguing attachments like cat heads and male genitalia in what appeared to be a comment on female pleasure. Her other artwork comments on many social issues, including police brutality, American politics, and the concept of femininity. After struggling to make ends meet as a full-time artist, Dori entered the comics industry as a janitor at the Last Gasp publishing company, where eventually she was promoted to a bookkeeper. And it wasn't until 1981 that her first comic, called Bloods in Space, was initially published under the male pseudonym David Seda in Robert Crumb's comic magazine Weirdo. And Weirdo would go on to publish many of her, usually her most controversial comics throughout her life. So, Seda's comics are known both for their shocking depictions of so-called degenerate lifestyle and often drawing on her own experiences living as an impoverished artist in San Francisco in Reagan's America, where funding for the arts was continuously being cut, specifically in this comic called How My Parents Encouraged Me to Become an Artist, which focuses on the near constant financial struggle of her life as a full-time artist. And an article from the Comics Journal explains that How My Family Encouraged Me to Become an Artist also has a historical precedent. Even though Seda does not mention it in the piece, the U.S. government increasingly attacked art in the 80s with its desire to engage in something called New Federalism, which was when the Reagan administration sought major reductions in Medicare as well as all other social welfare and domestic spending programs. One of these domestic spending programs was the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Reagan administration not only decreased funding to the National Endowment in the administration's early years, but also planned on phasing the endowment out completely. The National Endowment often provides funding for poor and rural art centers, so the endowment's defunding would have definitely affected impoverished artists like Dori Seda. The stereotype of the starving artist was not exactly new in the 80s, but Seda's How My Family Encouraged Me to Be an Artist can definitely be read in the context of a newly neoliberal government disinterested completely in the liberal funding granted to the arts throughout the mid-20th century. So this is just one example of how her comics definitely commented on a lot of social issues. This comic, called Hospital Hell, paints a grim portrait of a 2013 that's ruled by Ronald Reagan's robot brain, and where America is called Ronnieopolis. This story follows Joe, a young man with a tumor who struggles to find healthcare in a world where universal healthcare has been completely outlawed. This hospital he goes into is completely overrun with waste dumps and diseases running rampant. And a nurse tells Joe that since he has no health insurance, their new policy is to send him away to die in the streets. Joe's journey is a very wild one in this comic and features a very troubling scene where a nurse coerces him into having sex with her, definitely illuminating the many issues that arise when universal health care and other systems are banned. Without actually mentioning these issues outright, this comic definitely can be read as a powerful piece of social commentary on Reagan's policies. However, not all of her comics were social commentary. Some were just flat out obscene. This comic here is called Cleanliness is Before Dogliness and was published in Weirdo, which was Robert Crumb's magazine, and is probably her most controversial. Apparently, Robert Crumb was a huge fan of Dori's, while the other editor of Weirdo, Peter Baggy, would often refuse to publish her work, and I can only imagine that Crumb and Baggy would have had a huge fight over this one, since it depicts a scene where Dori alludes to having sex with her own dog. Dori's friends said that throughout her life after this comic was published, she was constantly clarifying that she was not into bestiality up until the day she died. Dori's work really cannot be put into a box, and this comic just goes to show how wild her imagination was and how unique her work really was. Dori's comics were published in a bunch of popular underground magazines like Women's Comics, Twisted Sister, and many more. But sadly, just as her promise as a comics artist began to grow, her health began to decline, and in 1988, at the young age of 37, she passed away after contracting the flu. As a lifelong, very heavy smoker, Seda struggled with emphysema, and from her work on ceramics without using proper protection, she suffered from silicosis or black lung. It's said that these issues compounded and ultimately cut Seda's life very short, unfortunately. And her legacy does remain in the world of comics and definitely continues to inspire artists to tell their own stories and critique the social systems that bind them. One of Dori's Good friend Bob Davis said after her death, in Dori heaven, nothing would stir until sundown. The streets would be lined with bars, great for dancing. Brewski, formerly known as beer, would sell for 10 cents a glass by law. There'd always be a John Waters movie starring Divine playing somewhere. The same for Andy Warhol films, especially Dracula and Frankenstein. No one would understand the prime rate or care about the GNP. Best of all, not only would cigarettes be cheap, they would be good for you. And another one of Dori's good friends, Don Donahue, said this: I've heard it said that Dori lived life in the fast lane, but I saw the part that moved at a snail's pace. Day after day, night after night, glued to the drawing board. She worked hard. She loved fun and friendship. She was one of the best people I've ever met, and I miss her constantly.